With all the questions surrounding the Denver Broncos at the cornerback position, there's a second-year undrafted rookie free agent cornerback by the name of Art Green who stood out during the offseason program. We'll tell you what he can do to maybe make the roster here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thank you for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. Every single day, you can get this podcast for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So make sure you do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team from an objective point of view. We bring you coverage every single day, all year long here on Locked On Broncos. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there, predominantly orange.com. Yesterday's episode, for all you everydayers out there, we really highlighted three young offensive players who stood out during the Broncos offseason program. It's only right that we go on and we talk about three young defensive players who stood out during the team's OTAs and mandatory minicamp period. And there's a handful of guys there that really are kind of not being talked about enough, and we'll break that down here on today's episode show. So first off, we'll highlight a little bit about Devon carving out a role for himself. We'll talk about Jonah, Elliss, the Broncos' 76 overall pick in the NFL draft, how he could maybe make an impact sooner rather than later. But we're going to kick things off by talking about a second-year undrafted rookie free agent cornerback in Art Green, who was on the team's practice squad all year last year, was one player, in my opinion, Sayre, that really stood out. You know, you and I have talked so much about positional versatility. We've highlighted the guys who have been playing inside and outside. It almost feels like Art Green is going to be, because of his size and his length, it seems like he's going to be designated kind of like Pat Surtain as really an outside guy, like the guy you really want to have on the outside, because you're going to face some of those taller wide receivers, those lengthier guys. I thought Art had a really good offseason program, and the practices that I watched had some great pass breakups, had tightly contested coverage. It looked like he took a next step forward in comparison to last year, where, hey, he was one of those guys that we were looking at. Could this be an undrafted rookie free agent that makes the roster? He was on the practice squad, and he got a lot of reps and developed a little bit last year.
Got that red shirt year, although he wasn't doing nothing, right? I mean, obviously, when you see guys like that are highly prioritized, undrafted free agents, and Art Green has all the traits. Like you mentioned, the size, Cody. I know he had big-time speed coming out of the college level, so there's all the traits there to work with. And then there's the ball skills, you know, the things that you see on tape when you watch him and you watch his highlights from college, and you're like, man, like he's really close on a lot of these plays too. And he's already making a lot. So he was one of those players that was borderline draftable, probably one of the most exciting undrafted guys the Broncos had gotten last year. And it's easy to forget about those guys year to year, because it's kind of just like you planted a seed in the garden and you're like, oh man, I forgot I planted that seed. You know, I forgot we had that. That's now it's starting to sprout up a little bit here a year later. I think that's kind of where we're at with Art Green. It's like the luster of him being maybe one of the biggest gets for the Broncos in 2023 undrafted free agent market now has worn off. So it's got to be stacking the days at OTAs and in training camp and making plays in the preseason. You know what stinks though, Cody, is the Green Bay Packers are having joint practice with the Broncos in July, and they're going to be needing corners. So I kind of am afraid that, you know, whatever he puts out there on tape during the offseason program or the rest of it, training camp, you know, preseason, you kind of get the sense that like it's either he makes the 53 or he's going to be gone this year for the Broncos.
There's a possibility of that. I mean, but I think that the Broncos, knowing what Sean Payton has said about, I mean, obviously building the right 53-man roster, I think so much of this conversation when we do our training camp position previews in the next couple of weeks, specifically once we get to cornerback, is going to be, okay, like how do you prioritize like what you want and who you want and how you want it done in terms of filling out your depth? Because, you know, we're seeing Jaquan McMillan play inside the nickel. We're seeing him play on the outside. We know Pat Surtain can play on the outside, can move to the inside in certain situations. Chris Abrams-Drain, obviously one of the Broncos draft picks, is doing a little bit of the same there. But to be honest with you, there's Damari Mathis and there's Riley Moss. So how is it that a guy like Art Green, how can he get opportunities to maybe crack the 53-man roster? Or, hey, maybe it is a second year on the practice squad, but then maybe this year he gets elevated a little bit. I know in the final game of the regular season last year against the Raiders, he did get elevated, if I'm not mistaken, to the active roster, but I don't think he played in that game overall, even though he got the elevation there. But for me, I just think that this cornerback room right now is in a much different spot than it was last year. I felt like last year there were more question marks than there were answers. To be honest with you, I'm not as worried about corner right now as I used to be. And I think that a guy like Art Green, if you really feel like can continue to develop, which to my understanding from people I've talked to, they really like Art Green. But the question is, like, is he ready right now? He's going to have to prove that during training camp. He's going to have to prove that during the NFL preseason. And certainly you need guys with that body type to be able to play on the outside. And look, I'm all about positional versatility. You know me, but you need guys at the cornerback position that have length, that have good ball instincts. And from everything that I saw from him so far in OTAs, mandatory minicamp, he is tight to the hip on a lot of these routes that receivers are running. He's making plays on the football. He's getting pass breakups. And to me, I think that's an exciting growth because last year in training camp, we kept watching. We're saying, all right, we need to see Art Green make a play here soon. And he just was, I don't think he was comfortable last year. I think he's much more comfortable now in this system and in this scheme from carrying over what he did last year. I think he can be in a really good position this year to make some hay in the offseason. I think the biggest key here too, Sayre, we always have to talk about it. You have to have contingency plans at cornerback, especially if there are injuries that do pop up, which that happened in training camp for the Broncos, unfortunately, last year with two guys.
Yeah, you have to have depth. I mean, what did Vic Fangio say? You basically have 96 starting corners across the the entire landscape of the NFL with how much you spend in the nickel. And so you have to have lots of depth at this position. And Vance Joseph even said that recently, but he didn't say that exact thing, but he basically talked about how you need to have like 4, 5, 6 guys at that position to be able to play. And so it is critical to have that depth. And I was interested too. I know you just touched on a little bit of it with the confidence aspect of things, but the biggest difference between a guy like Art Green last year to this year, last year he's the undrafted guy and he's, got a pretty big guarantee from the Broncos to come into camp and to come into their offseason program. But, what is that big difference that you see? Like, when you talk about confidence, like what is that? What does that look like for fans who aren't out at practice, and seeing that and seeing his development? I mean, you saw him a lot last year, obviously, more than probably anybody in Broncos country because, well, that was where he was playing, was at practice, right? So what do you see from him that's different in terms of that confidence aspect? Is it attacking the ball? Is it the way that he's mirroring receivers? Like, what are you specifically seeing that you think, makes him a standout at this offseason?
I would say one of the things it doesn't seem like he's thinking, which is good, right? As a defensive backs coach, you don't want your guys to think. If you guys are thinking too much, then obviously you can stop your feet. You get frozen a little bit. You may peek into the backfield and look at the quarterback, and all of a sudden you lose track of the receiver. I mean, he's doing those things that you mentioned. I think from a technique standpoint, when he's playing off-ball coverage, he's mirroring the release of the wide receiver, right? I think one of the number one things you always have to be careful when you're a cornerback is, all right, if a receiver releases outside, you understand, okay, he might be running vertical. He might throttle down and go to the sideline. He might even, they coach it up, like run an out route out of an outside release. But more importantly, he's stemming it well, right? That's a term we use in terms of the DB world, like stem, move with him. He moves outside. You got to get in alignment there. You don't want to lose a margin of step in terms of where you're at with the receiver. And then you also have to be able to get in phase, but you can't get too far outside because if he cuts back inside, then you have all this open space, especially with an outside release. So I'd say, like, from a technical standpoint, his fundamentals are much better. He's not thinking about it. He's just going out there. He's reacting, he's mirroring, and he's making plays and he's attacking downfield. That's the stuff I like to see here from Art Green. And he's going to be one of those players. Look, Broncos country, if you're talking about young players, under the radar players, you need to be keeping your eyes out for number 28 during Broncos training camp. If you plan on attending here when things open up, we anticipate July 23rd is going to be the open. Potentially there, we'll find out maybe the 24th. But that's the anticipated start date there. When you go to training camp, Art Green is a player that you need to watch. And speaking of another player to watch, the Broncos drafted Jonah Elliss, 76th overall. He had a strong offseason program. What can he do to build on that even further? And why should Broncos country pay attention? We'll tell you that and much more on today's brand new episode of Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at the Game Time app. And Game Time makes getting baseball tickets and NFL tickets even faster and easier because prices on the Game Time app, they actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch or kickoff. They have killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets to your favorite sporting events or concerts, comedy, theater, whatever is going on in your area. Game Time makes it easier and hassle-free. You can find last-minute deals where you can save up to 60% off of buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. In August, the Foo Fighters are coming to Denver at Empower Field a Mile High. You want to go check that concert out. Game Time has you covered. Or if you want to go see the Broncos home opener in week 2 against the Pittsburgh Steelers, Game Time has exclusive deals that go on inside the app. And you can take the guesswork out of buying tickets for your favorite sporting events with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Yes, again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase today. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
Even though he was the second pick for this team in the 2024 NFL draft, maybe Jonah Elliss could be one of the biggest steals the Denver Broncos got in their 2024 rookie class. We're going to talk about his great offseason and what he brings to the table this coming year for the Broncos on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But want to say thank you and give a shout out to all of you that make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, wherever and however you listen to podcasts and whenever. You know what? You could be listening to this podcast a few days from when we record. Doesn't matter. You're joining us wherever you're at and whenever it's convenient for you. But if you are listening a couple of days a week, hey, ramp that up to every day of the week so that you can become an everyday listener of the show. And if you're not already subscribed to Locked On Broncos on YouTube, and go ahead and do that. And while you're there, while you're on YouTube, I know that for me, I stopped listening to ESPN, NFL Network, all that other stuff, because you know what? I want localized experts talking about my favorite teams. That's why I made the switch, and I think you should too, to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news. And it's streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Cody, we're talking about legacies a lot in this year's NFL draft class, right? I mean, Marvin Harrison's kid got drafted by the Cardinals. Frank Gore's kid got picked up by somebody. What about Luther Elliss, the former Denver Bronco, right? And now we have Jonah Elliss coming in. It's kind of crazy, the family connection between Jonah and his family with the Broncos and their history and things like that. But ultimately, he's got a chance this year to prove that he's maybe one of the bigger steals of this rookie class. I know he was the 76th overall pick. I know he was the Broncos' second choice behind Bo Nix, but I still think this pick has gone a little underrated because of the hype surrounding Troy Franklin, Audric Estime, the offensive weapons that get all the attention, right? Why is Jonah Elliss, or let's talk about his offseason program, first of all. We'll talk about his potential to be a steal from this class. His offseason program sounded like he made a really good first impression on everybody.
Yeah, he did. And when I talk about, as best of an impression that you can do without pads, like what do we see? Like what do we evaluate? How do you evaluate an edge rusher when there are no pads, right? Well, for me, it's okay. Does he get too far upfield? Does he get too far outside to where he gets washed out and a running back can cut back inside? Or if he's stunting, does he get too far inside and get washed out with the rest of the, defensive ends? And then they create something to get to the outside. Like the Broncos struggled last season, I think in particular at edge rusher with that because their defensive line also struggled, right? And I think that they've boosted. They've got a little bit better there. They've made some big time upgrades in comparison to last season. We were talking about John Franklin Myers at defensive end. You talk about adding in Malcolm Roach, Angelo Blackson, other guys who have stood out in the Broncos offseason program, but it's also allowed the edge rushers, I think, to look even better, right? To have more success, starting with Nick Benito, Baron Brown, and Jonathan Cooper, and Jonah Elliss. The Broncos' top 4 pass rushers here, Sayre, I think throughout the entire offseason program, they looked really good. Now, I'm excited to see when the pads come on, when they can actually introduce the physicality aspect of it, because I think that's something that we will see from Jonah Elliss that we didn't get to quite see during OTAs and minicamp because you can't have physical contact. So for me, from a technical standpoint, he's so disciplined. That's the one thing I really, really like, right? If, for example, if he's trying to protect and keep edge contained, he does a great job of squeezing it, keeping his outside hand free. That way, if there is a run that goes to the outside, he's there. I don't know how many plays that I saw where he would have blown up a play in a real game and it would have been a tackle for a loss behind the scrimmage, or he flustered a quarterback to a point where he couldn't do it. And then there was one time where he got a reps with the first team defense, and Jarrett Stidham went to go throw a screen pass to Javonte Williams. And who was there to knock it down? It was Jonah Elliss. So for me, you see the effort, you see the high motor. This kid's got a really good work ethic to him. And I think for me, just you want to see that carry over into training camp. When you throw the pads on, how do you adjust when an offensive tackle can now grab you and be physical with you? How do you fight through that if you're being held? Like you're going to see that. Like you're going to get held in the NFL. Are you going to let him hold you? Or are you going to fight through and club through? To me, he is an exciting player, good burst of energy, and I think he can bring a lot to the table here. I think, to be honest with you, Sayre, with the injury to Drew Sanders and with we know the rotation there at the Broncos edge rusher position in certain situational packages, I think Jonah Elliss is not going to look like a rookie as a rookie. I think that's going to be something that we do see play out here this upcoming season.
I'd be fascinated to know if there's any discussion between he and Nick Bonito. You remember Nick Bonito really struggled his rookie year to find that role that you just talked about, and we figured like at worst, Nick Bonito is going to come in and he's going to provide the Broncos with that. He's going to be that rotational rusher and he's going to be able to give you, at least a few sacks in his rookie year. And then ultimately we barely saw him at all. So what can Jonah Elliss learn from that specifically? And how can that be avoided? Like you said, when the offensive tackles are able to start getting their hands on you and start to be a little more physical when the pads come on, that's where, the difference between NFL play strength and the college level play strength is going to be abundantly obvious. I mean, I expect Jonah Elliss to get knocked on his back a few times by Garrett Bowles or Mike McGlinchey, and that's okay. It's all about how you come back from that and what you do as a pass rusher to change your plan. That's the one thing that I think when you're watching pass rushers, and maybe it's just because we've been so spoiled with the likes of Von Miller, DeMarcus Ware, and a handful of others through the years here, Cody, but you see the plan unfolding throughout a game. You see how pass rushers kind of set guys up, almost like a great pitcher in baseball who uses a certain pitch to set up a strikeout pitch. That's kind of how pass rushers operate in the NFL, right? And you saw that from Jonah Elliss a lot. If you watched last year from him at Utah, man, he uses certain moves to set up other moves that he wins. So he's got a really good pass rush plan. And I think that is going to help him tremendously as he begins his NFL career, and he's got NFL bloodline. So that kind of stuff helps as well when it comes to knowing what to expect, knowing how hard you have to work just to get onto the field in the first place, and then to stay on the field. Like he has the benefit of people in his life who can tell him like, hey, this is what you got to do every single day. If you want to play, if you want to make an impact, you can't take days off in the gym. You can't not go into the film room and watch tendencies. You have to be able to win based on knowing an offensive tackle's weakness. I think Jonah is going to be so much further advanced in that regard than a lot of edge rushers coming in, because he has those bloodlines and because, like you said, that effort, that hustle, that work ethic that he has, that he brings to the table, it's a special trait that you see consistently when he plays.
To quote an all-time great movie, Hustle and Flow, it ain't about the size of the dog in a fight. It's about the size of the fight and the dog. Anyway, some people may know what I'm saying. Some people are like, you're crazy, Cody. What the heck are you talking about here on today's episode of the show? The thing I do like about Elliss, you can tell this kid he studies the game. Like he lives, breathes, eats, sleeps football. Like that is just who he is. And he has this determination to him to get better on a daily basis. That's going to be good. But it's like, as you mentioned, you got to take the punches too when they come. I'm excited because I don't feel like in OTAs and minicamp, and look, granted, we didn't have access to every single practice. In OTAs, we had access to one practice per week out of a 3-week span. And then we only had 2 days of mandatory minicamp. I'm curious to see maybe how he did on those days we weren't able to attend. We'll probably never, ever know this, but you face adversity, right? How do you respond to it early on? I would not be surprised if we see him have a big standout performance during the NFL preseason. He's going to have to play a lot there alongside guys like Thomas Incoom, other guys on the roster, Darrell Chami, who we haven't even talked about. We'll get into that obviously as our training camp position previews get a little bit closer. But Obviously, Elliss is a name I think Broncos Country absolutely needs to keep their eye on here going forward. Now, we talk so much about building out depth and obviously having guys on the back end of a secondary that can step up in roles, not just on safety or corner, but particular on special teams where you need to have production. You need to have guys who can play it. Devon Key is a name that Broncos fans need to keep an eye on, and we'll tell you why here on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos. Denver Broncos safety Devon Key is a name to watch here for Broncos Country. After building some momentum during the team's offseason program, we'll tell you about what we can expect him to do and maybe where he can fit in a potential role in the active roster here in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos. Real quick, wanted to say thank you so much, Broncos Country, to all the everydayers out there for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, as always, subscribe or follow if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. Without all the clickbait stuff, without all the hot takes, you get objective, to the point, insightful conversations surrounding the Broncos here on the show. We appreciate you so much there. Sayre, let's talk about a guy who we kind of talked about a little bit last year. I had a chance to speak with him several times in the locker room last season when he was a member of the practice squad. Devon Key taking a step forward here this offseason and earning some praise there from Sean Payton. I mean, when Brandon Jones was dealing with a little bit of a muscle strain, we started to see what the safety rotation would be like. Look, Hayden Stearns is expected to be ready back for the start of training camp, from what I have been told. But without him there at OTAs and minicamp being able to do stuff, you have to see what some of your other young guys can do. We got a little bit more of a look at Tanner McAllister. We got a little bit more of a look at JL Skinner, Keidron Smith, and some other guys. But Devon Key actually was a guy who stood out to me next to PJ Locke when getting some opportunities with the first team defense. Not only did he get reps there and I think look solid in terms of his run fits, his angles, and obviously going through and, I don't know what the defensive play call was exactly, so I can't really speak to that. But I think on special teams as well, you hear it so much in the NFL and today, if you know it. The personal protector on the punt team is one of the most important jobs you can have, really, outside of gunner and obviously like long snapping. Like, it is a key portion of making sure your punt team has success and doesn't screw something up. Devon Key's been a guy on special teams that's been standing out so far this offseason. And I think when you consider the Broncos' injury history at safety, you need quality depth. And I think Devon Key is making a really good case early on to say, hey, keep an eye on me. I need to go out there and earn in training camp in the preseason, but I might be able to be the guy who goes from the practice squad last year to making the 53 this year. We talk about development. He is a name that stood out to me.
And he's a former undrafted free agent of the Kansas City Chiefs, incidentally, and back in 2021. So he's been around for a while at this point, 26 years old. And I mean, when you think about a guy like PJ Locke, I mean, PJ is probably a bit further along now than, Devon Key is at this point. But at the same time, it's kind of a similar trajectory, isn't it? I mean, for years, it felt like PJ Locke was lingering on
since
the
2019
squad. Since 2019, he's around, and he was one of those guys that was like, just to be brutally honest, Cody, like when you hear his name get brought up in the offseason, you're kind of like, oh yeah, PJ Locke, really solid in the preseason, beloved by the coaches because he stepped up when there was an injury or whatever. But honestly, I never really took it seriously until he started getting extended playing time in the defense. And then you're like, I mean, this guy's he's pretty good, and he could play a variety of spots. Maybe Devon Key is a similar type of weapon for you there. I know that when he was coming out of the college level, NFL draft expert Lance Zierlein of NFL.com projected him as a 6th or 7th round pick, applauded him for his work ethic, which came across as the way that he attacks as a safety, and his explosiveness, 38-inch vertical jump, 4.53 in the 40-yard dash, which is nothing to scoff at, although I know it's, people aren't impressed by anything that's not under 4.4 these days. He's an explosive player. He's got special teams type of athletic traits. He's been around for a long time at this point. And to me, he's kind of one of those guys that it's just like, I feel like his name's come up one too many times to ignore at this stage, right? I mean, it's not just that he's popping up as a standout this OTAs. It's like we've been kind of mentioning him throughout the course of the last year or so for the Broncos. And so maybe all that time on the practice field, all that time in the film room, that time spending, with the coaching staff, maybe it's all about to pay off for Devon Key.
Well, he's got a great young mindset, too. I really enjoyed the conversations I had with him. He's very sharp in terms of understanding concepts of the game. And look, it's different sometimes, like as a member of the media, when you're talking to players, I'll be honest with you. There are a lot of media members around the world of professional football that don't really understand the game, right? And I think when you can learn a little bit, and I think there are a lot of players that do a great job of being able to explain and help teach it to, I think, reporters and media sometimes that maybe don't understand it. But just my conversation, just talking with Devon Key, this is a guy who's just plugged in nonstop. Like, in the open locker room sessions that we get during the regular season, he was sitting there every single time with his iPad, watching film and seeing what he was doing and taking the feedback that his coaches are giving him. And he's carrying it over the next day in practice and just asking him about the level of patience that is required. Hey, like, I'm sure you want to be out there in the regular season. I'm sure you want to be out there on defense. I'm sure you want to be out there on special teams right now. Like, how do you stay patient when you're not getting those opportunities yet? And he said, I just have to keep stacking days in practice. He's got a great mindset to him. And I think he's done a really good job of carrying over, like, all right, there's things I want to do this upcoming season. He took that into the offseason, carried that over into the offseason program. And now the next step for him is, hey, training camp is approaching. All right. So once you approach this juncture, now you have to continue to do that. I would even say, like, even last year, he stood out a little bit in training camp at the safety position and under the radar role, working with the third team defense. I think we're going to see a little bit more. Now it's going to factor in how does that change once Caden Stearns gets reintroduced to the rotation, because he's obviously a very important piece to what the Broncos want to do defensively alongside PJ and alongside Brandon Jones. You're going to have competition. He's going to have to battle against JL Skinner, Tanner McAllister, who's had a pretty solid offseason program as well. So, like, there's a lot of competition at this position. But I think overall, Sayre, this is what Sean Payton wants. This is what he was alluding to. You have a lot of young guys. You have a lot of competition. I think it would be a little concerning if there was an area of this team where it's like, all right, you only have like 2 or 3 position battles you're really watching. I'll be honest with you. There are probably 5, 6, or 7 different position battles, not even for starting jobs, that I'm like, hey, I want to see how this plays out, because this could have an impact on the overall depth of the team going into the regular season. You need key special teams guys, especially with the new rules there. Devon Key is a guy that I obviously got some praise there from Sean Payton. One thing, when I asked him about what he's seen from Devon Key, he said, he's really attacked the offseason program well. He's had good days out here consistently, right? And so that's the thing we want to see, consistency. Now, carry that over into training camp, carry that over into some preseason games. Make the case is my number one thing that I would tell all these players that are fighting for rush spots. Make your case. And the best part of doing that, you got to do it in camp. And that's coming up right around the corner. I'm stoked about it. Broncos Country needs to keep an eye on number 26 when they're out there attending practices this summer.
I love it. I think it's one of those great things about training camp, about having a 90-man roster. It's one of the things that you and I both love the most about the preseason is guys like this getting an opportunity. I mean, unless teams start going to way more joint practices and things like that, the level of competition gets raised when you go out to those snaps that these guys get in the preseason can give you a true glimpse of what they can do for your team. And so I think for a guy like Devon Key, it's going to be essential to not just keep stacking days and being consistent, but to also be consistent, but also make those splash plays when you get the opportunity, right? When you get the chance to make a break on the football and pick a pass off, like take that ball away. Don't let the ball hit the ground. Like he's in that position right now, Cody, where I feel like he's just a splash play or 2 away. He's already doing the stacking days. He's already got the consistency. The Broncos love him as a practice player. Obviously, he's helpful to them in that way. But to get on the field in the regular season, make those splash plays when you get the chance at training camp and in the preseason.
Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show as we highlight 3 young defensive players who stood out during the Broncos off-season program. Denver has interest and could obviously add more to their defensive line as they had interest in a USFL. Oh, geez, not USFL. It's UFL. I don't know why I said USFL. I'm going to restart that.
Yeah, no problem.
And Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show here, really highlighting 3 young defensive players who stood out during the Broncos offseason program. For all you everydayers out there, the Broncos, they've added to their defensive line, which has already been an upgrade, but they're adding from the UFL. Who's the new player that they've added to the mix, and what type of impact might he be able to have? We'll project that much more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.